guys, welcome to another episode of The Floor is Yours. This time we have six more debaters with us inside, and the motion standing before the House today is that this House believes that with the ending of the Warsaw Pact, there is no further justification for the existence of NATO. One of my favorite topics on this debate so far. In side proposition, we have Ainish, Pradyum, and Nirupam who will be speaking in that order. And inside opposition, we have Ion Basu, Ojas, and Orithro. It is Ojas' first time here, so welcome Ojas. And with that being said, let's move on with the debate. Each speaker will get 3 minutes to make their case. That being said, Ainish being the first speaker and the last winner of our debate, you will be beginning. You have 3 minutes on the clock. You may feel free to begin.
Right, pleasure to be back. All right, members of the House, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, caused a lot of controversy in the 90s in a quaint little place called Yugoslavia, fairly after its purpose was fulfilled, considering that the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics had fallen. Now, now understand that in order for it to be discontinued, I need to define what it has become after the depletion, after the cancellation of the Warsaw Pact and the fall of the United States and the fall of the USSR. Now, understand that no matter how much NATO's PR will have you believe that it is a bastion of democracy around the world and especially in Europe, and it is in the business of promoting peace, it is not. It is simply a mutual security organization, meaning that it guarantees that any military aggression against one of its states, against one of its members, will be answered by all of its other members in some kind of pacifist bloc, but it isn't some kind of pacifist bloc that exists to promote world peace. Now, understand that what this loosely translates into is that the United States, the creator of the NATO, has now come up and calls all the shots in the organization. Now, since a lot of this fall deals with since the debate today largely deals with the discontinuation of the Warsaw Pact, we have to understand how the USSR or the ex-USSR, present-day Russia, fits into this. Now, the USA had a chance of bringing Russia into the organization after the collapse of the USSR in 1991. Now, the fact that Russia was not included into NATO and that it did not receive the same kind of economic support as other former Warsaw Pact members, such as Poland, demonstrates that the American politicians' true intentions was perfectly aligned with the designations of NATO's missions as formulated by NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay. Keep the Soviet Union out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Just substitute the Soviet Union for Russia, and you get the picture as USSR may no longer be around. The attitude of American as well as British policymakers towards the largest country in Eurasia has not changed one bit. And together with NATO bureaucrats, they have been extremely happy to have Russia as the bogeyman to justify their continued existence and add additional defense spending to enrich their friends in the weapons manufacturers lobby and by extensions themselves. The USA is very happy to have a strong foothold in Europe, which, if left unchecked, could manage to become a serious geopolitical competitor if Germany and Russia somehow manage to become closer diplomatically. Hence, the United States continues to harp on for the continuation of the NATO to make sure that its position as top dog isn't to make sure that its position as top dog isn't
Anish,
removed.
wrap up.
All right, wrapping up. Now, American political scientists were ecstatic about the fall of the Soviet Union. Medals were awarded for the contribution for the fall of this ideological enemy, and various intellectual and semi-intellectual works were penned. Most famous of which, "The End of History" and "Last Man" by Francis Fukuyama. Now, it would be naive to expect the United States and its allies to weaken themselves, because what this means is that they disband their key military alliance that has risen to the position of the uncontested international military juggernaut with the disappearance of
Anish.
its only true international competitor. Just, couple more seconds.
Anish, I'm gonna have to stop you there. I'm
All right.
sorry. However, thank you for your speech. It was a good speech. However, I must remind you and the other speakers from next time to keep to the time restrictions that are already in place. With that being said, let's move on with the next speaker. Oh no, before we do, we have a question answer session with Ainish, of course. So whoever has a question, do raise your hands. I think Orithro has a question. So Orithro, you may proceed.
So since most of your arguments revolve around the fact that NATO is giving USA a stronghold in Europe, and USA's sphere of influence is increasing in Europe, and USA becomes a bigger power with its stronghold in NATO, what happens once NATO is no longer existing? Russia's power of influence increases in Europe. Is that better than having a more USA-centric Europe?
Now that is completely subjective, depending on which political commentator you choose to ask. Now, for me, as an Indian, I it doesn't matter to me whether Eurasia is controlled by the United States or by Russia. Now, what you're saying now, while now it is being proven that by the eastward expansion of NATO since the downfall of the USSR, that the United States' influence in Eurasia and Europe in general has been increasing. Now, what you're saying now, if the NATO disbands, this is only speculation that Russian influence over Europe will increase. So, if you're going to base your entire answer based on speculation, again, the answer only leads to being as subjective as possible, and a huge what if not.
Right, fair enough. Thank you for your response, Anish. Orithro, I hope that answers your question. That being said, is there anyone else with a question on Ainish's speech? Right. So, seeing as there are none, we will now decide to move on with the next speech, which is, of course, from the first speaker of side opposition. Coming back to our debate, Ayon Basu. Ayon, are you with us?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are both audible and visible. Ayon, you have 3 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Right. So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. The motion for today basically asks whether the NATO still has any relevance after the Warsaw Pact has essentially been dissolved. So, firstly, to understand that, let us focus on the aftermath of the Warsaw Pact itself. In Eastern Europe, most of its countries have been incorporated into the NATO community, and that has been generally beneficial for them. The countries that had actually participated in the Warsaw Pact that is mentioned in our motion today had been left in poor shape after the collapse of the USSR. But NATO, however, became a pioneer in integrating these countries into the fabric of modern Europe, which was implemented through the individual partnership action plans, which set forth standards that had to be met for a country to be admitted into NATO. Some scholars argue, yes, that the standards stipulated in these action plans gave several Eastern European countries sufficient incentive to improve the conditions within their territory, and that has only contributed to their own betterment and no one else's. By forcing aspiring non-member states to adhere to its high standards, the NATO essentially facilitated the modernization of much of Eastern Europe. Therefore, despite the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the NATO has still been very relevant in upholding peace and modernization, even in Eastern Europe, which region was originally contrary to its own ideological beliefs. Therefore, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact does not render the NATO redundant in and of itself. Secondly, let us focus on what happened after the Warsaw Pact. Once it was deprived of its original cause of creation, which is the Cold War threat, which is the existence of the USSR and subsequently the Warsaw Pact, it had no apparent reason to continue on as an organization. However, instead of just quietly disbanding, the NATO seized this opportunity to redefine itself and its objectives. The Western world has rapidly transitioned from a security environment with one major threat, that is the Eastern Bloc, to a diverse range of potential threats such as terrorism, piracy, weapons proliferations, etc. The NATO has adapted itself in order to counter these new challenges presented by an increasingly globalized planet while simultaneously maintaining its original doctrine of mutual defense. Evidence of NATO's commitment to collective security can be seen in its activities in Afghanistan, in the Gulf of Aden, and beyond. The NATO has also vested its vast resources towards the causes of humanitarian intervention and relief. Its ability to create a tangible difference in crisis situations with its extensive military infrastructure frankly sets it apart from many other humanitarian groups, including even the United Nations.
Ayan, wrap up.
Lastly, a point, concluding statements, lastly, a point that can be raised against the NATO's success is the Iraqi war, but it needs to be seen as an exception to the rule because there's an overwhelming majority among its other projects such as Afghanistan, Somalia, etc. And in this overwhelming majority there is relative harmony that is found between the member states. In fact, even on an issue as divisive as Iraq, all the member states were able to unanimously agree upon the resolution to
Ayan.
deploy NATO military advisors to train the native Iraqi army, and therefore, to conclude my speech, the NATO isn't irrelevant in today's day and age, even though the Warsaw Pact and its original cause of creation, that is the USSR, has been dissolved. Thank you for
Right,
your.
right. Thank you for your speech, Ayan. Once again, a little more of a stern warning to all the speakers. Please make sure you're sticking to the time limit. I don't like interrupting you, and I won't be. However, if this does carry on, I'm going to be forced to mute you about 15 to 20 seconds after your speech time has elapsed. That being said, I will now be taking questions on Ayan's speech. Thank you for your speech again, Ayan. Anish, I will take your Pradyum, I will take your question, followed by that of Anish's.
Thank you for your speech, sir. So, when you pose the NATO as a symbolism of modernization of Eastern Europe, you completely ignore the fact that it is going through several crises at a time, at the moment. And you ignore the fact that there is conflict within the organization as a whole, which prevents it from carrying out its actions in the ideal way it might want to.
Good
What is the
question, Ayan, your
question?
response. Pradyum, could you repeat
Anyway,
your question?
My
couldn't
question is
hear a bit of it.
So my question is simply this. So when you talk about NATO as a symbolism of modernization, are you ignoring the fact that it has internal conflict within the organization and it is going through several crises at the same time, which arises out of disagreement between the member states as a whole?
Right. So I think I addressed this in my speech as well. A prime example of this is cited. The Iraqi war is cited as a prime example of this discord between its nations because it was a rather divisive topic. Frankly, it has to be taken as an exception because in several other cases, in most other cases, in fact, for example, as I mentioned in my speech, Afghanistan and Somalia, there has been harmony between the members when it comes to actual action and implementation of its resolutions. In fact, even in Iraq, I've said all of this in my speech. Even in Iraq, the member states were able to agree upon the resolution to deploy NATO military advisors to train the Iraqi army. So, yes, there are discordant tendencies. There are conflicts within its members and within the interests of their members, but ultimately it all combines to actually implement actions irrespective of the mutual differences. I hope that answers your question.
Hopefully it does. Thank you for your response, Ayan. Pradyum, I hope that did answer your question. Good question and good response from the both of you. Now moving on to Ainish's question. Ainish, proceed.
All right. This question builds upon Pradim's question. All right. Considering that the NATO's main sphere of influence was supposedly at first was defined to remain within the domains of Europe, or to remain within the domains of Europe, and Iraq and Afghanistan were not signatories, were not member states. Does it justify? Does it justify? Do you? My question is simply this: do you believe that it is okay for 30 member states all around the world to police the for 30 countries of the world to police other states which aren't even members or refuse to ask for help in the first place?
When the situation in these countries, in these non-member countries which haven't even asked for help, is adverse and it is genuinely affecting their populations and general geopolitical trends as a whole, the intervention is necessary in the interests of larger world peace. And therefore, even the UN does interventions because they are necessary, because they're important and they help maintain general world peace. Therefore, since the NATO has the resources to do these interventions, to be able to help these countries, the countries may not always ask for help, yes, but their condition is still as adverse as it is if they do or do not ask for help. I hope that answers your question. And it needs resolution. It's adverse and it needs resolution.
Follow up,
Right.
Grant?
Um, I apologize, but I will not be granting that. A good question, Anish, and again, good response, Ion. That being said, we will now move on with the next speech, which is from the second speaker of side proposition, with 3 minutes on the clock. Ojas, your first speech. Feel free to begin.
I think it's Pradyum's speech right now.
Yeah, it's Pradyum.
All right, Pradyum was second. Okay, my apologies. Um, we'll go with Pradyum. Pradyum, feel free to begin.
Why members of the House, while in complete respect of the speech by the first speaker of the opposition, we have to realize that there are certain flaws within his logic. When we talk about the NATO policing around certain countries and there being disagreements within the NATO, we do not compare the NATO to the UN. The UN is an international organization simply for the preservation of international peace, whereas the NATO is bound or is basically based on mutual support, mutual military support. So if there are disagreements, they are not like disagreements within the UN, that they are disagreements between countries which are supposed to support each other. Now, beginning with justification, is there any further justification for the NATO to exist after the Warsaw Pact has been destroyed? No, not destroyed. It's basically it's basically past its time. So when we do that, we have to talk about NATO's purpose, right? And NATO's purpose, as defined by itself, should be the basis of cross-examination. We will look at NATO's purposes, we will look at the strategic concepts, and then we will cross-examine and look at real-world evidence and see whether it actually has a pertinent purpose in practical and pragmatic terms or not. Now, what is a strategic concept? Strategic concept is basically a document which the NATO produces on a periodic basis to outline its purposes for the pertinent time period and to look or to overview political developments in within the organization, right? So looking at the strategic concept of 2010, which is the most recent strategic concept the NATO has. It describes NATO as a unique community of values committed to the principles of liberty, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. When we talk about that, are we ignoring the fact that a Turkish president Erdogan is a political leader of a country which is part of the NATO? Do we not talk about Jaroslaw Kaczynski, which is the ruler of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, who governs Poland? Do we not talk about Viktor Orban, the political leader of Hungary? Do we not talk about the repression of the rule of law? Do we not talk about the repression of the opposition parties? Do we not talk about the complete rejection of free speech? And does it not talk about the importance of NATO in securing democracy, with which it aims to do? Therefore, when it talks about being an organization which supports democracy or the rule of law, it simply stands ineffectual, and thereby we have one basis of the NATO dismantled, which is the rule of law. It has simply delegated its democratic purposes to the backbench. Now we talk about international security. We talk about its action in Syria. It has simply refused to take action in Syria recently, and the Bashar al-Assad government has simply been strengthened. Syria has overtaken almost all parts except Idlib, and the USA, which is the leading vocalist against China and which calls upon the NATO to take action against China, has isolated itself from the NATO because the NATO chooses not to engage itself in pertinent topics of international security. Now, essentially, obviously, these are
Pradeep, wrap up.
crises which have not come. I will be wrapping up. Which have not come just out of the blue. Are these are fallacies in the NATO which come out of a multipolar world. And when the opposition talks about a multipolar world and the increasing pertinence of the NATO in a multipolar world, we do not simply talk about we simply do not talk about multipolarity outside of the NATO. We have to notice the fact that there are moving parts within the NATO itself which dismantle it as an organization bound on mutual support and not on preservation of international security.
Right. Thank you for your speech, Pradyum. A very good speech indeed. With that being said, we will now be taking questions upon his speech. We will be taking one from Orithro. Um, and that's all there is for now. If there's another, we will recognize it. So, Orithro, feel free to
Seeing as
proceed.
there are none, can I ask two questions?
Right. We'll see to it. Start with your first.
Okay, so as one of your teammates, as one of your members of your stance pointed out a few minutes ago while asking a question to one of the members of side opposition. So the question asked was that can the NATO intervene in matters of its non-member states? So I'll ask you the same question. You mentioned Syria. You mentioned NATO is not taking any action in against what's happening in Syria. Is the NATO supposed to take action against non-member states, against something happening in non-member states?
So when you look at the NATO and its purposes outlined in the strategic concept 2010 literally says that a certain purpose of the NATO is to preserve international security and to impact the world and how it revolves around them. And when we talk about the NATO not taking action in Syria, we're simply not talking about only a non-member state. Understand the fact that the war in Syria is not a war between the government, is not only a war between the government and the rebels. It is a war involving Russia, Iran. It is a war involving the US and the Western nations, which are significant parts of the NATO. And if the NATO cannot take action in Syria, it is not only not taking action in a non-member state, it is taking action. It is not taking action which it is supposed to take when it is in a war, where its allies are fighting.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the response, Pradyum. And seeing as there's no other questions,
So
Orithro,
very
go ahead.
pertinent follow.
Yeah,
Yes,
go
yes.
ahead.
So
Oh, right. I'm so sorry to cut you off, Orithro, despite recognizing your question. But Ojas, do you have a question?
Yes, I do.
Right. Go ahead. I apologize, Orithro, but he hadn't asked a question.
Sir, you talked about how NATO has many internal disagreements. But isn't that good in a way? Because NATO provides countries to have a platform to have diplomatic disagreements. Whereas if NATO didn't agree, they would declare war on each other and there would be massive amounts of casualties and whatnot. So isn't that good in a way?
Right, sir. So I see you talking about the importance of NATO as a platform for nations to consult each other. However, these are not only diplomatic disagreements, they are disagreements over the very principles on which the NATO stands. There are disagreements about the rule of law, as mentioned in my speech. And a certain disagreement which has arisen in the NATO is the disagreement against the increased Chinese influence. You talk about certain NATO member nations, such as Italy, which has signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative and which is reluctant to take complete action against China. You talk about Germany, you talk about its increased dependence on Russia, and therefore you talk about several or severe disagreements over the very basis of mutual support, and you talk about NATO's importance in a multipolar world.
Right. Hopefully that answers your question, Ojas. And thank you for the response, Pradyum. With that being said, we'll move on with the next speaker, which is the second speaker of side opposition, which is Ojas, in fact. So, Ojas, for your first speech, we will. You have 3 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Right at the beginning of my speech, I want to address something very important to this motion: the origins of the NATO. So, when the NATO was founded in 1949, its founders had in mind the aim of opposing the Soviet Union, right? And by 1955, as an extension, opposing the Warsaw Pact. So, I'm not denying that, right? The original aim of the NATO was to oppose the Warsaw Pact, and but saying that, and in 1991, the Warsaw Pact came to an end. But saying that as the Warsaw Pact has come to an end, NATO doesn't have any justifications for existing, is naive. Because let's look at the official aims of the NATO. Let's look at the treaty itself. Let's look at Article 2. Article 2 says that all members are. I'm going to paraphrase the articles. Article 2 says that all members are supposed to work towards maintaining peace and stability. Article 5 says that if a member of NATO is attacked, then it will be considered an attack on the entire alliance, right? So these articles, these aims provide security to the members of NATO, right? Also, even though the Warsaw Pact has come to an end, we simply cannot ignore that there are other threats too. Threats will always come, issues will always come up, and saying that as the original aim has been addressed, the organization doesn't serve any purpose is very is flawed, because there are other issues which the organization may tackle and successfully resolve even. For example, let's look at its success in multiple regions, such as um, in Kosovo. NATO intervention in Kosovo has saved multitudes of civilian lives, right? And also let's look at its successes in piracy in the African coastline, right? Like for example, which has gone down by 75% since 2011. So NATO is still relevant. NATO is an extremely important organization even today, right? NATO serves multitudes of purposes, and it is an extremely important organization even today, as it provides or its members with a platform, and it gives its members a sense of security. And on top of that, it even has economic benefits. So um, uh, uh, so I would like to end my speech with this: NATO does have justifications for existing. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your speech, Ojas. Welcome to the floor is yours. That being said, we will take a question from Ainish now. Ainish, go ahead.
All right. My question is very concise and pertains to the examples you cited as NATO's quote unquote success. You said NATO's intervention in former Yugoslavia and Kosovo saved multiple lives. Would you say that the indiscriminate bombings of Kosovo, which have displaced millions and has reduced the city into ground zero, a success? And number two, Somalia, while piracy has gone down because of NATO intervention in Somalia, Somalia is now currently in a state of anarchy. Would you also consider that a success?
Yes, sir. Regarding Kosovo, the many lives have been saved by the NATO movement there. And regarding piracy in the African coastline, if you look at the data, it has gone down by 75% since 2011.
Right. Thank you for your response, Ojas. I hope that answers your question, Anish. Ojas, feel free to send me the source that you quoted the statistic from. That being, yeah. That being said, let's move on with the third speaker of side proposition and wrapping up the debate for them. It's Nirupam Biswas. Nirupam, are you with us?
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible but not visible.
Yeah, I don't think I'll be able to turn on my video camera without internet issues because I already have very low bandwidth.
Not a problem. We will have a live reaction with the cameras that are on. That being said, Nirupam, feel free to begin. You have 3 minutes.
Okay. So I'm the third speaker, and the basis I'm going to be going at is the entire structure on which the proposition's argument are supposed to be based. Now, that is the fact that with no actual purpose, with no purpose existing, that is the purpose which was supposed to be NATO's purpose from the beginning, the fact that it doesn't exist anymore. Now, the motion is that with the ending of the Warsaw Pact, there is no further justification for the existence of NATO. Now, first off, why was the NATO created? North Atlantic Treaty Organization, created in 1949. Now, notice this word was created collectively in order to form collective security against the Soviet Union. Notice the word collective, and the first word and the word collective, which my teammates have already talked about, collectively taking care of anything the Soviet Union may pull out of its sleeve. And the thing is, the Warsaw Pact, at its basis as well, has been formed in reaction to the formation of the NATO in order to form the counter alliance for the NATO organization. The basis for the entire formation of NATO was to stop that one powerful nation. And now that the one powerful nation doesn't exist, the basis of NATO doesn't exist at all. Now, to come to the speakers who have spoken for the opposition, the first opposition speaker said all the wondrous things about the NATO, claiming it to have done the things which other organizations are actually supposed to be doing right now. And it's saying that while completely, and he's saying that all of that completely ignoring the fact that the basis of their argument is supposed to be based on relating the Warsaw Pact to the NATO itself. Now that the Warsaw Pact doesn't exist, how does that affect the NATO? Is what they had to argue on. Whereas when he goes on claiming the NATO to have done a lot of myriad of good things to the world, he's forgetting the fact that that's not what they're going to be. That's not what they're supposed to be proving. Besides, he talks about how the organization is upholding peace and whatnot, but ignoring the fact that the opposition that the opposition of the peace which the NATO is supposed to be upholding doesn't exist anymore. The basis doesn't exist anymore. That is the Warsaw Pact. Now, the other organizations exist in order to uphold peace. And if they cannot uphold peace, then the NATO is not supposed to be jumping in. Now, the previous proposition speakers have already pointed out, the second speaker of the opposition somehow thinks that the existence of internal problems in the NATO is a good thing, and then talks about the fact that if one of the member nations is attacked, then all of the member nations will take charge. How can this be a good thing? If one of the member nations, say the US, is attacked, everyone comes together and it takes charge in order for that attack or in order for that war, whatever is happening. That cannot be a good thing for maintaining proper geopolitical relations and actual world peace. Whereas the entire argument of your opposition is based on world peace. Now, the second speaker also comes up to give a myriad points talking about the successes of NATO, but again forgets that its entire purpose is destroyed. And the other things which the NATO does, there are other organizations which do the things the NATO is supposed to be doing right now. So that's all for my speech. Thank you very much.
With the pinpoint ending to your speech, thank you very much, Nirupam. Are there any questions to his speech, or shall we move on? We have one from
I think I
Ion.
raised my hand.
Right. We have a question from Ion, who is also coincidentally gone as well. So, Ion, shoot your question over to Nirupam.
Am I visible?
Yes, you are. Thank you. Nirupam, Ion, you are.
Right. So excuse the noise if you can hear. Speaker
Yeah,
is
please go ahead.
he mentioned in his speech that it was our job to define it. Firstly, he mentioned in his speech it was our job to define the justification of the NATO existing with respect to the Warsaw Pact. But if I read the motion correctly, the motion read that after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, there is no justification for the NATO's existence. And secondly, he also said that he also mentioned in his speech that that
I think his video is crashing.
Right. In that case, I think we'll have to skip over this if Ion is not available. Um, right. Ion has internet issues and is no longer in the meeting. Therefore, what we will do is we will move on. Nirupam, if he returns, we will take his question. If he doesn't, we'll have to move on. I will mark you solely on your speech. That being said, we will now move on with the final speaker of today's debate and the final speaker of side opposition, which is Orithro Mukherjee. Orithro, feel free to begin. You have 3 minutes on the clock. The floor is yours.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
The parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. What did I just read out? The first article of the NATO. Nowhere in this first article is the mention of the Warsaw Pact. This was the first article of the North Atlantic Treaty, the founding body of the NATO. Now, how this treaty does not mention Warsaw Pact anywhere. How does the third speaker of the proposition still argue on the fact that NATO's existence or purpose is conditional to the Warsaw Pact? Now, today's motion, or the motion for today's debate, is very clearly this House believes with the ending of the Warsaw Pact, there is no further justification for the existence of NATO. I just gave the members of the House a justification for the members of the NATO. There needs to be body to settle any international dispute in which there may be involved by peaceful means. Now, moving on, and further on, if the proposition tries to limit NATO's work and importance to the existence of the assumed Eastern and Western blocs, as they were called by the Warsaw Pact existed, let me tell the proposition that after the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO has conducted not one, not two, not three, but 19 operations since 1991 involving Bosnia, Serbia, USA, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya, Turkey, and a lot of other countries. And that's basically one for each year since then. And there's a lot more. And not only this, the 16 members of the NATO have also invited Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic, among other countries who were a part of the Warsaw Pact, to join them as well. There are strong arguments for enlarging the alliance and, above all, securing the democratic and Western orientation of the selected former Warsaw Pact states, hedging against political uncertainty in Russia. And this was introduced by the Clinton administration itself. Now, again, these are more justifications for the existence of NATO, inclusion of the members of the Warsaw Pact, member states of the Warsaw Pact itself. And the dissolution of the Atlantic Alliance would mean the end of a transatlantic collective defense. Europe would have to provide for its own security without the United States. For some who still view this transatlantic community as a unique and indispensable achievement, it would look like a nightmare, members of the House. And there is more. The end of the NATO would also deprive the Europeans and North Americans of an important framework of legitimacy for the use of military power. Without the broader NATO framework, the political and military stamina required for dangerous long-term stabilization missions, such as Afghanistan, could not be generated. Ad hoc military operations among the United States, Canada, and European countries would still not be possible. And the disappearance of the NATO's common defense planning and exercise practice would result in an ever-diminishing military interoperability among them. The end of
Wrap
NATO,
up, Arithro.
the end of NATO would also be an enormous challenge for allies such as Canada or Turkey, as they do not have the opportunity to organize themselves to ties to Europe through their membership in the European Union. Sir, and other members of the House, today the motion says that there is no justification for the existence of NATO. And having given you so many justifications, I believe I have conclusively made this case for the side opposition.
Right. Thank you very much for your speech, Orithro. That being said, we have now come. We have come to the end of all the speeches for today's debate. We will conclude the debate with two final questions. One from Pradyum and the next from Ainish. Pradyum, kick it off.
Thank you for your speech, sir. So at the starting of your speech, you very eloquently quoted an article of the NATO Charter, and you talk about how it preserves international peace and security. And then you said that I just gave you my justification for it still existing. And then you went on to say that the NATO has not committed not one, not two, but 19 operations in the world. And now do you think that the commitment of so many operations with so many million people displaced, the NATO is actually backing up its justification of preserving international peace and security in accordance with the own logic presented in your own speech?
Could you
Arithro, your
repeat your
response?
question once? I got lost. Sorry.
Right. Condense the examples and citations. Just the question.
So very simple. You stated that the justification for it still existing is in the charter about it preserving international peace and advancing such peace operations. And then you went on to say that it has committed 19 operations in the world, and you mentioned it as a justification for the NATO still existing. Do you not think that these two contrast each other? And do you not think that the NATO cannot back up its justification for still existing?
Absolutely not. These 19 operations conducted since the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, they were conducted in the hope for international peace, which is preserved by the first article of the North Atlantic Treaty. The NATO is just fulfilling what its article prescribes with these 19 operations conducted since then.
Right. Thank you for your response, Arithro. That being said, let's move on to Ainish's question. Ainish, go ahead.
Again, similarly, building up on Pradyum's question, you talk about how the NATO is essential to world peace and how it is commendable to have an organization so committed to world peace. Now, on the off chance that the many other countries similarly decide to take inspiration by this and decide to create their own special in groups, also very committed to the notion of world peace, would this not be taken as an affront to the NATO, and then not only lead to a war between nations, but a war between organizations, subsequently causing World War III?
Sir, I will give you the exact answer you gave to my question. These are a lot of, you gave the exact answer which you gave to my question. These are a lot of what ifs and speculations. But then coming to answer your question, if another organization suddenly decides to appear out of nowhere, where a bunch of countries say they have similar ideologies and they decide to create an organization of their own, the United Nations exists to make sure it doesn't go out of line. That is the purpose of the United Nations. The United Nations sees the need of it, and since the NATO's first articles clearly states that it does not go against any of the purposes stated in the United Nations Charter itself, NATO exists.
Follow up. This is pertinent.
I understand that it is pertinent, and I see what you'll be getting at. However, it's okay. You aren't going to be marked on your question anyway, so it's okay. Take it easy. That being said, we have come to the end of today's debate, and as my maths teacher would somewhere around the world be very proud, because I have been able to tabulate these marks as the speeches carried on. So I'm keeping not too much suspense for you guys. So I'm just going to say a few words before I give out the results. I found one very weird lack in this debate. It was a good debate. A lot of you gave good speeches, but you weren't, a lot of you, in fact, all of you to some extent, weren't really sticking to the motion, right? Look at what the motion says, right? It's talking about why the NATO shouldn't exist, and it's also referencing the Warsaw Pact, right? None of you, or very rarely did you all ever bring up why the Warsaw Pact has any relevance to this. None of you were very detailed as to why NATO and the Warsaw Pact have any relations, why the NATO was created, why there is this speculation over its existence, over and because of the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and so on and so forth, right? So one thing that I really wanted you thing that you really wanted you guys to bring up was why the Warsaw Pact is there. What's this whole trade-off situation between NATO as to Warsaw? Okay, so you should have really drawn that fine line there, and set somewhat a precedent for the debate. Because see, when just one big term is there, there's definite, and there are a bunch of little terms around it. In this case, NATO was the big term because everyone knows about the NATO and not so much the Warsaw Pact. But if you follow some amount of history, then you'd understand it. But if, despite the fact, any motion that you get, right, there is always going to be some, I mean, if there's going to be some amount of little words that complement the main subject of the motion. Make sure you see how that those little supplementary words to that motion connect to that main subject and tackle it from there on out, right? Because I found that main aspect of the debate that was very striking about this motion to be missing, right? Again, and secondly, a lot of you were very reliant on the principles of the NATO, what the NATO charter says. I'll keep it very simple for you, right? What the NATO charter says does not matter here, right? NATO's regulations, NATO's work, NATO's principles do not matter here. It's asking you whether or not the Warsaw Pact's dissolution has anything to do with whether or not NATO should go on. So you should tell me that there are this reasons and this pressing reasons as to why the NATO should exist, despite the Warsaw Pact being dissoluted, or the Soviet Union turning into Russia, so on and so forth, right? And vice versa for the other side, right? Therefore, I think you guys have understood what I was getting at here. And I mean, it's not, your speeches were structured, but when you're getting a debate, in any debate, right, don't rely heavily and read off like most of you guys were. I think all of you at some point were reading off of some article or some statistic, right? The only, you're very lucky that these debates that we're having right now on Flow is Yours are online, because when these are in everywhere you go, debates are done in person, right? And you won't be able to read through these statistics. You'll have to understand these statistics, understand these principles. By giving me random examples like 75% of this crime is reduced there and there, I don't need that. Look at the principle that it's arguing, right? And argue upon that, right? That's the only reason I asked for the statistic, right? It doesn't matter that much, right? That being said, I have given you enough two paisa gyan of myself, from my side, and I will now be declaring the results. I felt that side proposition carried the debate, and I believe that, and I will be giving out one best speaker and one runner-up best speaker, which will and the runner-up will be Ainesh Dutt, and the best speaker is Pradyum Nahata, and here's why. I will tell you why. I kept two awards because, I mean, I don't. There's no point giving out multiple awards and multiple draws. It's not very valuable, right? So the main reason why these two are getting the award and not the others are very simple. These two, Anish and Pradyum, you guys were very close. Firstly, and you were only separated by a bit of quality of your answers. Inish went over the time a little bit. All of that factored in. Pradyum pulled a little ahead at the very end. Yeah. So all the rest of you, Ojas, Orithro, Ion, Nirupam, what again? You guys were very reliant on these statistics and these principles that aren't very useful, right? You understand the examples that I gave, and you guys can go back upon this recording and when I upload this video, and you can check why I said what I said. Go over the motion again, see what you said in your speech, and then reflect on what you should have done better. I mean, there's always going to be a point where you're saying, oh, I could have said this better, that better. So instead of just looking at what you could have said better in this debate, look at the way in which you debated and see what type of argument could you mention for a motion of this nature. uh, Make sure when you're looking at it, you're not looking at it from the perspective of this motion, so you're prepared for this motion later. Look at it from the perspective of the type of motion, the type of debate you brought to the table, and the way you can change that to make sure it's better. Same applies for Pradyum and Ainesh. Even you guys were missed out a little bit on those parts that I mentioned, right? So go over it, see what's what, right? That being said, thank you all for joining in. That's it for me. If there's anything you guys have to say, say it. Otherwise, I will be ending.
GG boys, GG.
Right. Fair enough. Thank you, Anish. That being said, thank you all for joining in. I hope you all enjoyed, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the near future. That's what that was, and we'll see you on the next one.